Hey guys, this is a really cool episode where I interviewed Israel Halperin on how to essentially personal train clients and what clients can say, ask, and do during their sessions to get more out of their trainers. So stuff like what to focus on. So should I focus on, for example, in a squat, focus on my feet driving into the floor, or should I focus on something like pushing the floor away from me? So an internal versus external cue. And then things like telling a client how many repetitions they're going to be doing for that set prior to the set starting versus something like, hey, start moving and then I'll tell you when to stop. So how stuff like this implements into a session and actually affects performance in a positive or negative way. So this is a really cool episode on how to essentially get more out of your clients as a trainer, and then as a client, how to get more out of your trainers and what to look and ask for. So I really hope you guys enjoy this one. There was a little bit of feedback on the mics due to how we had to record this podcast, so just be aware of that. It isn't something that I actually noticed after a couple minutes of listening. It just kind of blends into the recording, but just as a heads up, there is a bit of feedback. Having said that, let's get right into the interview. Enjoy it. Welcome to the N1 Fitness Podcast. Today we've got Israel Halperin on the show. Israel is a postdoctoral researcher at Memorial University in Newfoundland. He completed his PhD in Australia in conjunction with the Australian University of Sport, and his studies focused on the effects of coaching feedback has on performance and resistance trained subjects as well as combat athletes. Israel, welcome to the show, man.
Thank you so much for having me here. I can't wait to get going.
Yeah, man. So before we dig into the nitty gritty, can you just tell us how you got into all this combat sports stuff in regards to strength and conditioning and how you sort of got rolling in this industry?
Sure. So briefly, as a kid, I was heavily interested in combat sports, martial arts, the whole Bruce Lee thing, like many others. And I decided to go full force with it. And I was a competitive athlete for many years. I competed internationally. I spent time in the States, a whole year in Thailand for training and competition purposes. I traveled Europe, so I got a lot of interesting experiences, training in different places and interacting with different coaches and in different countries. So that was great. But injuries started to accumulate, and at one point I decided to quit. And then I naturally gravitated into coaching. So I started working with a lot of combat athletes, boxers, kickboxers, MMA athletes. I coached a few UFC fighters, both as a kickboxing coach and as well as a strength and conditioning coach. And over time, I just developed interest in the science behind all of this. So I completed my bachelor's in physical education in Israel. And then I knew that I wanted to continue doing the science part of things. So I moved to Canada, to Newfoundland, and I completed my Master's of Science with Professor David Bain. And I did a lot of cool stuff over there with self-massage, with stretching. And over there, I developed my interest in coaching feedback and coaching cues. And then I had a really unique opportunity to move to Australia and do my PhD at the Australian Institute of Sport. So my role there was to work with 4 Olympic national teams in the combat field. So that's wrestling, boxing, taekwondo, and judo. So on a daily basis, I worked with the coaches and athletes, just some S&C stuff, testing, consultations, and whatever else they needed, all while doing my PhD, which dealt with how various different types of instructions and feedback, how does that influence their performance. And then I moved back to good old Newfoundland, which I'm doing my my postdoc at the same place I finished my master's. So I'm attracted to cold weather, it seems.
That's awesome, man. Now, can you share a little bit about your research on internal versus external focus and performance?
Sure. So first, maybe briefly, I will explain what are the differences between the two different types of instructions. So it's usually a lot easier to explain what internal focus of attention is. And basically, it's when I'll be directing my athlete's attention towards a body part or a muscle group or anything to do with her body, essentially, as she's performing a motor task. So as an example, if you're performing a bicep curl, if I'll ask you to focus on contracting your biceps, that will be an example of an internal focus of attention, right? On the other hand, external focus of attention is essentially the opposite. It's you focusing on anything that's outside of the self, but still relevant to the movement task. I mean, that's a definition I like to use. I'm not sticking to the precise definition found in the literature just because I found that this is a lot easier to grasp this way. So going back to the the dumbbell example, the curl. So if I'll ask you to perform the exercise or the curl while focusing on the dumbbell, then that would be an example of external focus. Now, for many, I mean, there's a lot of literature, a whole lot of research on this topic that for the most part have found that external focus is better, is superior to internal focus, which is not necessarily intuitive to most personal trainers who commonly use internal focus. That's something that I've noticed in my experience, and I've actually got some research on that, not on personal trainers, but at least on coaches. And we know that's to be true with physical therapists and track and field coaches. And from my end, I've studied boxing coaches, and most coaches do tend to use internal focus instructions, despite the fact that we've got so much research showing that it's suboptimal, right? So anyways, my research mostly dealt with combat athletes. I wanted to see how does providing elite and sub-elite combat athletes, such as boxers and kickboxers, how will providing them these two types of instructions will influence their punching performance. And by punching performance, I'm referring to punching impact, so forces, as well as velocities. And what I found, which is a bit of a surprise, I suppose, because I wasn't sure how elite level athletes will respond to these two different types of instructions, but in line with literature, we found that boxers punch considerably harder, about 4 or 5%, which given the level of these athletes, this is actually quite a meaningful effect, right? And I've actually done another study of that nature, trying to see how these two types of instructions will influence the isometric mid-thigh pull. Are you familiar with the isometric mid-thigh pull?
I'm not.
All right, so I'll just briefly explain what that is. So essentially, it's essentially an isometric deadlift. So there's a force plate on the ground that the athlete will stand on it, and then we set up the barbell to be locked somewhere around the mid-thigh area. The athlete will hold on to the barbell and try to pull as hard and as fast as he or she possibly can, all while, of course, exerting force into the ground, right? Because the bar doesn't move. So it's a very simple exercise or test. We usually use it as a test because it's a very short learning curve. All you have to do is just exert force, right? It's not a technical exercise. It's isometric. It's not fatiguing. And it's actually highly correlated with a lot of interesting performance measures, such as sprinting speeds and other stuff like that. So it's a test that, at least at the AIS, we use quite frequently. It's also not time-consuming. I'm not sure if I already mentioned that. So anyways, given the simplicity of the test, I wanted to see whether the instructions, external and internal, would influence the peak force production of this test. And honestly, I didn't think that it would, given, again, how simple it is, and, there's no really movement involved. And we found 9% greater force production with the external focus attention compared to the internal one, which again is a huge effect size. And we tested athletes here, and maybe one more study before we talk about something else, if you choose to. I was also always curious, what happens when we exercise in front of the mirror? Right? There's mirrors everywhere, in all the gyms, personal training studios, we all love mirrors. It's really a part of our culture as personal trainers. But surprisingly, there's very little research on this topic. So I also wondered, in addition to how mirrors influence performance, I also was interested in this topic in view of external and internal focus of attention. And I'll explain. When you look at yourself in the mirror, what is it? Is that internal? For example, if you're doing a biceps curl in front of the mirror, so you are looking at your bicep. So in a sense, you are perhaps focusing on a body part. So that could be defined as internal focus. Or on the other hand, maybe because I'm looking at something that is external to myself, the mirror, and I'm seeing myself outside of myself, so to speak. So maybe that will lead to external attention, you know what I mean? So
that's fascinating.
And I always kept thinking about that. So I took a look at the literature, and I was very surprised to find very, very little research on this topic, mostly done on dancers, underpowered, very small sample sizes and mixed effects, but I wasn't very impressed with the quality of the studies. So I actually take pride. I think I've done the first study, I mean, again, to the best of my knowledge on this topic, and I've looked at how mirrors influence performance. So I had actually 4 conditions in this study. I had people perform an isometric bicep curl, and on one occasion, I provided them with external instructions. So I told them, pull the strap. The strap was attached to their arm, so I told them, pull the strap as hard and as fast as you can. Now, the strap is not part of the self, therefore that can be defined as external instructions, right?
Right.
On a different occasion, I told them to perform the exercise while focusing on contracting their biceps as hard and as fast as they can. The bicep is part of the self, therefore defined as internal instructions. And then I had another condition, which was just a mirror. So I placed a mirror that the participants could actually only see their own biceps contracting when they're looking at the mirror. They just set it up in that way. And we told them, perform the exercise to the best of your ability while looking at the mirror. And we didn't actually direct them either internally or externally. We just asked them to perform the exercise to the best of their ability, right? And we found that external, like always, leads to better performance. Participants applied much greater forces under the external condition. And then they produced the least amount of forces under the internal conditions. And the mirror was somewhere there in the middle. So it seemed as if the mirrors did not have a positive effect, nor did it have a negative effect on performance. It was somewhere there in the middle.
That's really interesting.
Part 2 of the study, and then part 2 of the study was essentially the same idea, but instead of the bicep curl, we just had them do a counter movement jump, and we found exactly the same thing. The effects were slightly smaller, but still people jumped higher under the external. They jumped with the least amount of height with the internal, and then somewhere there in the middle was the mirror. So it seems like it has a mixed effect.
That's really interesting. And I mean, I guess it would depend on the movement as well, because if somebody is doing, for example, a bench press or where they're lying on their back or something, there's obviously no mirror unless you threw one on the roof kind of thing. But there are certain movements
100%.
where you could utilize a mirror and then others where you couldn't. But that's really fascinating stuff.
Yeah, thanks, man. So I do hope to do a few more studies on the mirrors in the future. I just think it is a fascinating topic. And again, coming from the martial arts background and combat sports, we train a lot in front of mirrors. Technique, punches in front of mirrors. And I'm curious to know what effects that may lead to over time. And I'm just not sure what the answer is,
Yeah, exciting stuff, man. So as we move on, can you tell us about your findings around knowledge on exercise endpoint?
Sure. So that is another research area that I'm very interested in. So we do know that when we humans, when we know for how long we have to go for, say a race or whether you have to sprint right now for 100 meters or 400 meters, you'll pace yourself differently. even if I will ask you to go as hard and as fast as you possibly can, hold nothing back, right? And you'll be sure, you'll think that you're going as hard and as fast as you possibly can, but most likely what will happen is that you'll pace yourself. And what I mean by that is you're probably distributed your energy or your efforts a bit differently as a function of how far you're going to have to run or sprint for or whatever other activity you're doing. As another example, if I'll ask you right now with a given load, actually no, let's use a different example, a counter movement jump. If I'll ask you to jump as high as you possibly can 3 times, or I'll ask you to jump as high as you possibly can for 50 times, there's a good chance that the first 3 jumps under the 50 jumps, right, jump number 1, 2, 3 out of the whole 50, and we'll compare it to just you jumping 3 times on a different day, knowing that you're just going to have to jump 3 times. Am I being clear with this example?
Absolutely.
All right. So on one day, you're just going to have to jump 3 jumps, and then on the other day, you're going to have to jump 50 jumps. And I just want to compare the first 3 of the 50 to you just jumping the 3 on the different day. Hopefully I'm clear.
Yep.
And again, I'll be asking you to jump as high as you possibly can, right? Hold nothing back. Then if you're following my instructions, then theoretically, there shouldn't be any differences between the 3 jumps out of the 50 compared to the 3 jumps out of the 3 jumps, right?
Right.
That makes sense, I hope?
Yep.
Well, that's not what happens. We know that people pace as a function of the exercise endpoint. An exercise endpoint in the example of the jumps is either you're going to jump for 50 times or you're just going to have to jump 3 times. And I've done a study on this topic. I wanted to see how much force people will produce isometrically, right? So that means we hooked up their arm inside a strap, and the strap was connected to a force transducer that measured the amount of forces they can produce isometrically during an elbow flexion exercise. So kind of like a bicep exercise, right? And what happened is this. They came to the laboratory 3 times. On one occasion, I told them, please complete 12 repetitions of an isometric contraction. Go as hard as you possibly can, and you're just going to do 12 repetitions, okay? And they've actually done that. The first condition was very simple. I asked them to do 12, they did 12, okay? Then on a different day, I told them, they came to the lab, and I asked them, please perform elbow flexion exercises. And I'm not going to tell you how many repetitions you're going to be doing. I'll tell you when to stop. So I deprived them of an exercise endpoint. They didn't know if they're going to have to do 5 or 100, right? And actually, this condition is analogous to what happens in a lot of personal training environments.
Absolutely.
Where the coach or the personal trainer tells their client, you start, I'll tell you when to stop, right? That happens. This sounds familiar, right?
Totally.
So this was the second condition, and then the third condition was actually very stressful for me as a scientist. I told them that when they came in, that they're going to have to complete 6 repetitions, right? And as they completed 6 repetitions, I had to be all dramatic and say, oh my God, something happened to the computer here. It didn't record the repetitions. Can you please do a few more? And of course, I was essentially lying to them. The computer was perfectly functional. I just wanted to see what happened after they completed more repetitions, right? So after I lied to them, they completed another 6 repetitions. All right?
Right.
So what I didn't mention on the unknown condition in which they were deprived of an endpoint, that I stopped them after 12 repetitions. Okay? So then coming back to the last condition, which I deceived them, so they did 6. I told them, oh no, the computer crashed. Can you do a few more? And then they did another 6. So all in all, under the 3 conditions, participants completed 12 repetitions on every single day. And they were asked on each and every day to apply the maximal amount of forces that they can produce and hold nothing back, not to pace themselves. Just go all out, okay? And then you'd expect that if they actually did as I asked them to do, that the forces across the 12 repetitions across the 3 days would be comparable. But they weren't. When participants were deprived of an exercise endpoint, that is, when they weren't sure how many repetitions they were going to do, they applied considerably lower forces compared to all conditions. So that, to me, illustrated that when we don't tell our clients how many repetitions they're going to have to complete, they don't produce as much forces. They hold back. And that might even be subconscious, right? They may be thinking that they're going as hard as they can, but they're really not.
Yeah, and that totally makes sense. And I've done this personally in the gym, where I've experimented a little bit with some of my clients, and when I don't tell them how many reps they're going to do, I think it's only natural to just pace, but then when I tell them, hey, this is the repetition digit that we're hitting, they know where their endpoint is, and they can go all out but pace appropriately within that repetition range and essentially get more out of the set.
Right. That's perfectly reasonable. That's what I would recommend too. So when we take away their endpoint, they're just going to hold back because there's uncertainty about how long they have to go to. So I would recommend against that if you're after quality repetitions, especially those that require power outputs and maximum level of forces. So provide them an endpoint. Now, another interesting finding was that when they thought they're just going to go, when I told them on the third condition that they're just going to have to complete 6 repetitions, they actually produce greater forces when they thought that they're going to produce 12 repetitions. So when they thought they're going to have to do less, they actually produce greater amount of forces. And that to me was unbelievable, because we're only talking about 6 versus 12 repetitions. And mind you, they're in a laboratory under stressful conditions, knowing that they have to go all out. It's not just like a single session at the gym on your own. There's scientists yelling at you, asking you to go all out. So and it looked visually as if everybody was going all out. But surprisingly, when they thought they're just going to do 6, the forces were a lot higher compared to when they had to do 12. And despite the fact that they're asked to go all out, I mean, in some ways this is kind of obvious, but I don't think that it is. And then the conclusion, the practical conclusion, is that if you're looking for really high quality repetitions, then you got to cap the number of repetitions within a given set.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. That's amazing stuff, and so useful for trainers too, because they can essentially get more out of their clients, and then their clients get more out of the sessions just by setting the repetition digit ahead of time. That's awesome.
Exactly. So, and the interesting, just one final thing about that is it seems that because this is cognitively demanding. I mean, trying to pace yourself and all that, that's not something that's very basic, and we try to see whether this also happens with children, and we did not find such an effect.
Oh.
So it seems like you got to mature, perhaps psychologically or emotionally. I'm not quite sure what it is, but we were not able to replicate such an effect with adolescents. I think they're about average age of 13. So the effect that we found with mature adults, both male and female, was not present with adolescent children.
That's interesting, because I feel like kids have, they're less likely to pace themselves just in general. I mean, they're going all out all the time until they're essentially head hits the pillow, right? So, yeah.
Exactly, yeah.
So moving on to your research in regards to clients having some choice in their session versus simply being told what to do. How does that impact motor learning and performance in regards to clients having a little bit more say in their session, whether it's exercise selection, repetitions hit, or whatever?
Right. So this is a topic that I'm actually strongly opinionated about. I've done a few studies of my own, and recently published with a few of my colleagues a review paper about this topic, and the title of this review paper was Autonomy, a Missing Ingredient of a Successful Program. So autonomy, essentially, how do we provide autonomy to our clients, is by letting them have a say, right? Letting them make choices about the program. And the research is very clear about this. It's very clear that when we provide our clients, currently, nowadays, I'm mostly a researcher. I keep using the word participant or subject, but I should use I got to remind myself that I'm talking to personal trainers, so that's right. Clients or athletes. So when we provide our clients with choices in regards to the program, motor learning is considerably more effective. And by motor learning, I mean the robustness of how they acquire and learn a given motor task. So in our world, that would be a clean or a squat or a deadlift, the mechanics, the technique, right? They learn better. They perform better. And by performance now, I'm referring to maximal levels of forces or power. I've done a study that I've shown that providing combat athletes with a choice as to which order of punches they deliver. So I provided them a choice in regards to which punch they can start with, right? Just a simple choice. And elite level athletes punch considerably with more forces and velocities when I provided them with a choice. The research is conclusive and has been done across a broad range of populations, demonstrating that we involve the clients in the decision-making process and let them have a say or provide them with a choice in the training environment. That leads to more effective everything, pretty much. And what do I mean by a choice? It can be a lot of things. It could be, for example, which exercise to start with, the order of exercises, right? It could be how many repetitions to complete. Now, one thing that I would like to mention about the repetitions is that it's not that I would come to a client and tell them, all right, you choose how many repetitions you want to perform today. It's not that. I will, of course, narrow it to a range that I'm looking to work at. So if I'll be able to tell them something along the lines of, all right, on the next exercise, I want you to perform anywhere between 10 and 12 repetitions. You choose how many exactly. So I can restrict the choice to sit within my goals as a trainer, right? And interestingly enough, what we now know is that the type of the choice that we provide our clients doesn't matter so much, or at least it seems so. And what I mean by that is that even allowing our clients to choose the color of a TheraBand might actually also lead to very positive effects on motor learning and performance. So some studies have shown that letting participants choose the color of a golf ball improved their accuracy compared to the group that was not provided with such a choice. So even allowing participants to make a choice that essentially is irrelevant to the motor task improves performance, improves learning, which is incredible.
That's really cool, man. And something that I've found with my clients in the gym anecdotally is instead of leaving the choice completely open-ended, meaning what do you want to do next if we had gotten all of our work done in a session, as opposed to saying, hey, we're going to do some sort of hip hinge movement. Do you want to use a kettlebell? Do you want to use a barbell or a hex bar? I feel like what I've seen is giving them the options of the specific options that they can choose from versus an open-ended, hey, what do you feel like doing, is more effective, because a lot of the reason why people get personal trainers to begin with is because they want to be led through a session and not have to think too much. I'm not sure if you've looked into that as far as just an open-ended question versus a specific, hey, here are your options.
100%. I'm with you on this 100%. Definitely, we don't want to overburden them with too much decisions, right? Because, like you said, that's not what they came to us to guide them and, in a sense, make some of the decisions for them. So the general guidelines that I recommend is not an either-or approach. It's not either to have them choose everything or that we choose everything for them. It's just my basic recommendation is to move on this spectrum of no choice to all choice, gradually moving towards more and more choices. Now, how exactly do you apply this philosophy? That depends. that depends on your clients. Some may appreciate and want more autonomy or more choices during their session. Some may want less. But I would say that as a general rule of thumb, moving towards having the client more involved in the decision-making process is definitely healthy and appropriate. Now, how much choice is enough? I don't have an answer for that. That really does depend on the specific interaction with each and every client. But as a rule of thumb, especially if we go by the research that's been published, that is so powerful and so consistent across populations, this is definitely a good rule of thumb to go by.
That's great. Now, as we move on to sort of language and the cueing of coaching, what does your research show in regards to that and how individuals perform based on the differences in there?
That's a fantastic question. And unfortunately, the research, at least my research, hasn't unfolded to that stage yet. Because, everyone responds differently to different cues. And even within my research, stay on external and internal, right? So we got to keep in mind that we're working with statistics. So for example, if I would test 20 people, 20 subjects, then for the most part, what I would observe is that between 15 to 17 people from that group that I studied would respond better to external focus instructions. But there will always be those 4 or 5 people that will respond better to internal. But then we got to keep in mind that I have to average the results, and on average, of course, it's better to go with external. But that doesn't mean that some people out there don't respond better to internal. So the research, what it provides you with, is a general strong guidelines that works well on average. But sometimes that doesn't mean that you're not going to have a client come in that may respond better to different types of instructions, and this will be your goal to try to find out who the person who's standing in front of you is. But like you said, to date, I just don't really know. I don't have a rule of thumb that be able to tell you, all right, persons with such and such personality type will respond better to this or that type of feedback. Is something that a coach's eye and experience will have to figure that out, at least for now, until more research comes out.
Yeah, I guess that's job security then.
Yeah. The coach's eye is always going to be a huge part of it. That will always be there. No research will ever take that away from a qualified and intelligent personal trainer.
Absolutely, man. So Israel, as we start to sort of wrap up here, can you give trainers and just folks in general that are going to potentially be working with trainers or already are some take-home messages and practical implications in order to implement this stuff in a real world way?
Of course. So let's just recap the things that we've talked about, and then perhaps I will throw in another bonus tip, right? So for the most part, you want to use more external instructions. So you want to refer to something that is external to the client's body part, but still relevant to the task. So in the world of personal trainers, I'll be asking them to focus on the barbell, on the dumbbell, on the band, on the machine, something that's not part of themselves. For the most part, you'll see better performance and learning when you do that. The trick is that they're not always easy to come up with. It's a lot easier for us to use internal cues naturally as coaches, as the research has shown. So my tip would be to think a little bit about it, because it's not necessarily natural, and it takes some effort and time to come up with proper cues that will work for you and that are also natural for you. And at first, it might be a bit difficult to use them on a regular basis. And actually explore now if people who are listening to me, they've heard the term, I'd say just Google. You'll Google the term, you'll find so much research and so many blogs and articles about this topic that will provide you with some guidelines. The second thing would be to be thoughtful of the endpoint. In the personal training world, we usually work with repetition numbers. I think be mindful of how knowledge of exercise endpoint can influence your clients, and be mindful of the fact that if you deprive them of an endpoint, for example, if you tell them a sentence along the lines of, you start and I'll tell you when to stop, will usually not lead to the type of performance that you're after. So I would say try to avoid such an open-ended exercise endpoint. And if you're looking for really high quality repetitions, then reduce the number of repetitions that you require them to do. At times that may be warranted, especially if you're working with athletes and you really want some, for example, a good cannon movement jump or something along these lines, right? Or a good medicine ball throw. It's just pure quality and actually get the athlete or client to put everything that he has behind it, then reduce the number of repetitions. That's another good cue to keep in mind. I would also say this, that it is wise to try to limit the number of and the frequency of feedback that we provide, because we sometimes tend to think that more is better, but some of the research in motor learning has shown that as a general rule of thumb, that less rather than more is usually more effective for learning over time. And the reason is this, that we allow our clients to actually reflect and think about what is happening in between repetitions, rather than just expect an immediate feedback, an external immediate feedback from the coach. So they actually develop some sensitivities within themselves to try to figure out when they're doing something right and when they're doing something wrong prior to you providing them with feedback. So I would say be mindful of that it's not always good to continuously provide feedback, too much of it. Try to fight that urge. I'm not going to talk about exact numbers because we don't have that research to talk about an ideal number. And of course, it will always depend on who's in front of you. Some may require more, some may need less. But again, as a general tentative rule of thumb, try to provide less feedback and instruction. Let your clients actually develop a sense of when they're doing something wrong by themselves.
Such important points there, especially that last one. I love that, because I think that if you're, for example, guiding someone through a push-up and you give them, I've noticed if I give them 5 cues back to back, it's like, holy shit, I can't remember the first 3 cues already, and I'm trying to focus on the last 2, right?
Exactly. There's this very funny study from, I think it's the 60s, and it's called 6 plus minus 2. It could be 7 plus minus 2. I don't remember whether it was 6 or 7, but really what it showed very simply that humans can remember up to 6 plus minus 2 digits in their working memory. So we can only remember roughly 6 digits, plus minus 2. And sometimes we provide our clients 6, 7 cues or instructions, which are a lot more complex to process than digits. So surely thinking about that many cues is just going to overload the system, and it's just going to be suboptimal. Try to use the most important cue, maybe another one after that, but then hold yourself back. Fight the temptation to keep providing cues, because it's not going to lead to the result that you're after, most likely.
That's amazing information, man. Now, Israel, if folks want to learn more about you, where can they find you on the interwebs? What are your social handles? Where can they just build their knowledge around this subject a little more via your research?
Well, I would say that I'm somewhat active on Facebook. It's just my name, Israel Halperin. I'm also slightly active on Twitter. And then, especially if they want to read my work, they can just Google my name, Israel Halperin, and I've uploaded pretty much all of my studies on this topic to the web, mostly to ResearchGate. They can download my papers off there, and of course, if they can't find anything, I'll happily send it over. That's one thing that's very important for me, is to try to keep my papers applied, so coaches like yourself can read them up and apply them immediately. That's very important to me. That's what I always try to do with my research. So I think that the intelligent personal trainer can benefit from actually reading the papers themselves. Maybe not be able to fully understand all the statistics used, but definitely get the gist and the most important messages, and just develop some sensitivities to the design that was implemented. I think that's actually also important for a personal trainer to have a basic grasp of how research works, because I think that once you develop that mentality of how to think like a scientist, that carries over very well into your work as a trainer. But maybe we can talk about that on a different time.
Yeah, I was just going to say I'd love to have you back, and I think that that's a really important point as far as trainers knowing roughly how research works, because touching back on what you said about reporting averages, if a trainer sees that, okay, this is the results of the study, so that means it should work for every single individual, and they stop seeing the personalized person that's in front of their faces, they can go awry a little bit. So I think that is so useful to treat everyone as an individual. Of course, use basic concepts based in science, but you might have to improvise a little bit based on the person that's standing in front of you.
Definitely. And how to do that is not that, it's not that easy and it's not that straightforward. It's something that warrants another conversation, which I'm sure we'll have in the near future. That's something that I'm also very passionate about. I actually teach courses to exercise professionals that's called evidence-based practices for exercise professionals, which I just developed the thinking capacities of just developing a basic understanding of science and research design, but not just for the sake of understanding it, but also how to utilize these concepts into your actual applied work. So I think that's a very important thing to understand for personal trainers and strength professionals and so forth.
I totally agree, man. I'll link to all that stuff in the show notes, and I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to come on and share this info with us.
Thank you for having me. I had a great time. I hope the listeners will get something out of it. Thank you, Marcus. I appreciate it.
Yeah, man, I know they will. All right, guys, I will catch you on the next episode. I hope you guys really enjoyed that interview with Israel Halperin as much as I did. There were so many awesome takeaways from that one. His research is incredible on personal training, coaching, and actually how to implement some of this stuff in a really useful way. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. If so, please do like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. And I will see you on the next episode. Bye, guys.